step when I introduced Bob that about a week ago, Houston Tomorrow had our 2015 Catalyst Awards. And Bob was one of the finalists for the Excellence Award, and he won the Excellence Award. Yeah. And then Christof was a finalist in the Engaged, and he won that. So we've got two of the city's biggest catalysts are in the room today for you. Christof is, I've admired him since he first started writing his little blog a long time ago. I missed that a lot. I wish he was still doing that. It got us all focused on how transit actually works. And then he was put on the Metro board where he showed Metro how transit actually works. And as Bob said, spearheaded and was that carried most of the water for this reimagining of the bus network, which is a stupefying accomplishment for which they're winning awards now. So, Christof, whatever you have to say, go for it.
So I love the theme of this conference because the way I tend to think of places is I love really empty places and I love places that are full of people. And I think the two actually work really well together. Like in the shot of San Francisco where you actually have a empty wilderness with a dense city in the background. And there's a lot of things I could talk about when it comes to this. I could talk about sort of the natural systems that we have here, and John Jacob did a great job of talking about that last night. And I could talk about sort of great urban places, and Bob just did a great job of talking about that. But fundamentally, I'm an engineer. So I'm going to talk about geometry. Because the reality is all of this stuff comes down to math. And we can start here. We can start with the fact that land is a limited resource. And the math is how many people can we get onto that land. So, for example, there's 0 people per square miles. There's suburban development at 1,000. There's a place like Midtown at 10,000. That's a big difference. And ultimately, if we think about what that means,
you trying to change it?
okay, I've managed to confuse the computer.
Actually frozen?
Yes, I got a spinning beach ball.
Oh no.
Not a good thing.
No. My favorite thing. You can remember what Max
Means is, if we have that many people moving here, how much land are they going to take up? And that difference of a factor of 10 ultimately is going to determine how many wild spaces we have left. So at its most basic level, that's what density is about. It's about ruining less of the natural space for every new person we get. And density is also about something else, which is access, which is the basic measure of how we live our lives. And that's also geometry. What access is this. It says in 30 minutes, how many things can I get to? In an hour, how many things can I get to? And those things might be jobs, those things might be education, those things might be retail. Access is what cities are about. Cities create economic value by putting lots of things within range of each other. And throughout history, we've increased access. And the way we've done a lot of that is by making those circles bigger. And the way you make that circle bigger is simple: you move faster. So that when we went from a walking city to a streetcar city to a car city, we've been ramping up that speed. And as we ramp up that speed, cities have gotten bigger. So that you can sort of see the evolution of London over different speeds of transport means bigger cities. And there's a second way of doing this. The second way of doing this is to make the city denser. Because the measure, once again, is how much stuff you can reach. We don't travel in order to put distances behind us. We travel to get somewhere. So if I put more stuff in that circle, I am also increasing access. So that's something like downtown Houston provides extraordinary access, not by moving people quickly, but by putting a lot of things next to each other. And so there's, and what that does in turn is it means less travel is necessary. It takes trips that, in that lower density version I might make in a car, and it turns those into walking trips. So fundamentally, I don't have to move as far to do the same thing. And that gets really interesting because it starts to change how we actually think about what we do. We think of that right there as a transportation project. But that thing right there, a new residential high-rise going up and downtown, is also a transportation project because it puts more people closer to work, more people closer to a rail line. And what's really interesting is this kind of transportation project tends to make our transportation system worse, and this kind tends to make it better. That most of what we think of building to avoid congestion is actually the stuff that causes congestion. And the stuff that we don't think of as transportation is actually the stuff that's going to do the most good. And so there's really two ways to provide access in the city. One is to have a low-density, high-speed city. And that's what Houston has been trying to be for its entire existence. You can judge how good we are at it and how high speed we actually are when you sit on the Southwest Freeway at rush hour, but that's how we have built this city. The other approach is to have a high-density, low-speed city, and that's Manhattan. Your circle isn't very big, but there's a lot of stuff inside it. And so you might ask, why can't we do both? Why can't we have high speed and high density? And that's geometry. The problem is the space that transportation takes up. So that, for example, a human being, I've got a turning radius of, I don't know, 2 feet if I'm walking around in the corner on an intersection downtown. And if I'm driving a car at 65 miles per hour, that's a 1,500-foot turning radius. And so if I think about those numbers, those shape the transportation infrastructure we have to build. I can, as a pedestrian, turn 90 degrees in that. As a high-speed car, I need that. And so that ultimately, that transportation infrastructure starts taking over all of my space. That highway interchange is the size of a neighborhood. And the transportation vehicles themselves also start taking up more and more space. That car holds 1 person. That bus holds 40 easily. And so if I look at Fannin Street out here, that train, that's 400 people worth of capacity. And those cars, which are occupying, I don't know, 4 times as much space, carry only 1/10 as many people. So the size of our transportation vehicles drives the scale of our cities. And it's not just moving the vehicles, it's storing. Each of us at work probably have more space assigned to a car than we do to ourselves. Our parking spot is bigger than a cubicle. And when we build the city, we are not just building 1 spot for everyone, we're building a couple. You all, I don't know, have 4 parking spaces in Houston that are built for you. And when we build buildings, we find ourselves often building more parking than we're building building. I mean, look at this. That whole thing is just to store cars back there. And it's as big as the building that it's serving. And as a result, the scale of cities has changed fundamentally. So here you look at the Noli map of Rome. This is a walking city. Here you have a streetcar city, South London. And you'll notice how the streets have gotten bigger. The texture of the blocks has somehow gotten bigger. So this is exactly the same scale. Here's Rome, here's London, here's Houston. And we've gone from a city of defined little streets to a wide open expanse with a couple of buildings sprinkled through it. And the streets have gotten bigger and bigger, from that 18-foot street to an 80-foot street to a 200-something foot street. And we're building cities on the scale of our transportation infrastructure. So if you care about cities, you have to care about transportation, since it's the fundamental plumbing that makes it work, but it's also what sets the urban scale of that city. What a city feels like is determined by its transportation mechanism. And it's amazing in a modern city how much of that city is taken up by transportation. Here's Uptown. Now let's subtract everything that's here just to move people to these places. And here's what's left. That's all that's actually generating economic return. Everything else is just the infrastructure to get you there. This is a major activity center, but that's an extraordinarily inefficient use of land. And the same goes when we start thinking about transit, that, for example, park and rides are a really inefficient way to get people onto transit if you look at the amount of land that they use. Because every rider has to have one of those spaces reserved for them for this to work. Ultimately, if we design transit around pedestrians, it's going to create a different scale of city than if we're trying to design transit to move people who show up in cars. And that means we have to think about pedestrian geometry when it comes to building transit. If we want a transit city, we have to build it on the scale of the pedestrian, as that's what's going to make efficient transit. So a quarter-mile walk, 5 minutes, that's about as far as most people are going to walk from one of those transit stops. So what does that mean? It means we have to think not just about the transit, we have to think about everything that's around it, because that's what's going to determine whether that transit works. So we have this tendency to think of transportation as lines on a map, and especially transit systems, but I think we have to think of it as zones of access. Dallas's system looks like it covers an awful lot of Dallas, but in reality it doesn't, because that's all it covers. That's all you can get to. Mind you, there's places in between those stations that you get a really good view of if you're riding the train, but no, you can't get there. So those circles are all you've got. And the measure of how effective this system is how many destinations are in those circles, how many people live in those circles, how many people work in those circles. And that's why density matters to transit. And we see this over and over again. Short transit in dense places beats long transit in not dense places all the time. Here's LA, one of the bigger modern commuter rail networks in the country. 40,000 weekday riders on those black lines. Those blue lines in the middle, 340,000. Those lines that stay in the dense places, that's where transit works. Transit works in density. And so if we look at Houston, we can start to think of it that way too. Our goal shouldn't be to do a transit network that covers everything. It should be a goal to put transit where it will do the most good. And if you look at population as well as employment, I would argue that Houston has a very defined urban core, and it's not the shape we think it is. It's most but not all of the 610 loop, because remember, there's ocean-going ships inside 610. That's not a walkable scale, that's not density. But it actually goes out on the west side, all the way out to about State Highway 6. This is the core of our city, the core of our population. It's all at relatively high densities where transit can actually work. And that's actually what the reimagined bus network fundamentally does. It puts as good a transit as we can do in as much of that area as we can possibly do, so they can serve as many people as possible. That's 1 million people living within that footprint, and 1 million jobs within that footprint. And what's remarkable about that is we now have one of the best bus networks in the country. I literally have transit planners from New York City going up to me saying, I wish we could do this. And if you compare us to our peers, we now have a bigger zone of frequent transit than most of our peers, and this is a weekday. This is what it looks like on Sunday morning when you really don't want to be a transit rider in Salt Lake City. But not Dallas either, for example. So that's good transit. Transit that carries lots of people is about getting in those dense places. And here's what Dallas did wrong and we did right. This is Dallas's medical center station. And notice that none of the hospitals are actually within walking distance of that station. That's because that station is on an abandoned freight rail line that goes somewhere near the medical center. This is what ours does. And now look at those ridership numbers. They get about 1,500 people average weekday there. We get 10,000 at 3 light rail stations combined. It's about getting that transit where lots of people want to go. And that means we have to think really carefully about where we put those circles. This is a transit stop in Chicago. You look at that circle, most of that is stuff that will never be walkable because it's infrastructure, as it's a wildlife preserve, and the rest of it is just barely walkable. You look at a place like Midtown, and almost all of that has the potential to be a great walkable place, and even that little bit of red, that's the Pierce Elevated, and if that goes away, there's no red at all left in here. And so, when we think about transit, we really need to think about what kind of things are we building to really serve that core. It's not about lines on a map, it's where you actually go. And then we also have to realize that transit works differently than cars do. If a couple of us are traveling in cars, we can go to different places. That bus will not split into pieces. So we need to run transit in lines that actually serve lots of stuff in the same line, and that means we really need to think about how we lay out our cities. For example, you have a transit line like this. If I build something new off to the side, I have to build a new transit line to serve it. That means trip times are going to be less efficient. It means I'm going to provide lower quality service since fewer people are riding on that part of the line. It means it will cost more to operate. If I do something like this, I'm going to inconvenience every passenger on that existing line, so that doesn't work either. If I do something like this, that gets better. It gets a little more expensive to operate, but good connections to everywhere, and none of the existing riders suffer. And if I do that, I get pretty much wins all the way around. Better for the existing riders, great for the new riders, and costs the same to operate. So really thinking about how transit works means we have to really think about how we arrange our cities around it. And that's something that an awful lot of planners are really bad at. This is a really famous new urbanist designing something in Salt Lake City. And there's 5 little neighborhood centers. Let's try drawing a bus route that goes to all 5 of those. That is the most efficient bus route possible to serve all 5 of those. So when we think about the fabric of our cities, we have to think about how transit works. And that means also thinking about walking, because we don't want to take that transit line out of the way to try to get close to your front door, since it's going to make that whole transit less efficient. And that means we need to think about pedestrian fabric. The Allen brothers actually got this right. And if you look at downtown, quarter-mile circle, that's a theoretical walking circle, actual walking in light color there, you can reach all of that. You go out to the suburbs where we rethought the way we design streets, and we managed to come up with a way of designing streets that's bad for pedestrians, that's bad for bicyclists, and that's bad for cars. And we've been doing that for the last 50 years all across the United States. And you go to Uptown and you see how well this works. And what that does to you is, at this point, you've got only 1/3 of that circle that you can actually reach. So that basic structure of how we design our cities is going to determine whether the math adds up, whether the geometry works. And that includes things like intersections, too. Public Works will tell you that in a perfect world, traffic signals are a quarter-mile apart. And that means that if you're in the middle of a block, you're going to have to walk 5 minutes to get to the other side of the street to make it to the nearest safe crossing point. That doesn't work. That's not a pedestrian city. And geometry is also about planning transit routes, about saying we're not about giving everybody a one-seat ride. We're about setting up connections, long straight routes, grids, so we're not forcing you to go through one place to travel to everywhere else in the region. And that has huge benefits. I mean, this is what reimagining does to people's travel times. One-way trip from the Heights out to Memorial City, 40 minutes faster. But that also gets us to all of those streets, and what do they actually look like? And that's math too. It's adding up all of these individual pieces. And so a lane takes a certain width, bike lane takes a certain width, sidewalk takes a certain width. And we've been really bad historically at allocating this stuff. Even in New York City, the pedestrians get way less than their share of the street, and the cars always get way more than their share. Here's Lexington Avenue, and you can see that 2/3 of the people using the street essentially are on foot, but they get only 1/3 of the space. So we've gotten into this really great idea that we can actually take streets and we can rearrange them. And we can say we take that street and we turn it into that, and suddenly it works better for everybody. What's interesting about that is it's just math. It's about saying we have this much space and let's use it intelligently. And it can do a great deal to make a place a lot more livable. But the question is, how does transit fit into that? And so, how do we fit transit into this? We build a subway. It's hideously expensive and we will get very little transit out of it. We put it somewhere off to the side where we have space, and that means it doesn't work. We end up with that again. Or we just say, let's just put the transit in the same lane as the cars, because then the whole math adds up better. We've got more space for pedestrians. And we end up with this. This is the typical streetcar line that's being built all across the United States. Most of them pretty much all in mixed lanes with traffic. And here's why that doesn't work. First of all, it takes longer. If you look at Houston, a bus from downtown to Wheeler Station, about 15 minutes, and a light rail train about 10. That's 50% faster because the train has its own lane. But moreover, if that transit moves faster, you can run more of it for the same cost. Your numbers get a whole lot better. And it gets a lot more reliable. So how do we do that? It's easy. It's just taking that space. We know how to do this. Sometimes it just takes paint. Best transit technology in the world, a bus lane. And it can work really well, but the problem is we always end up sort of fighting over this. In Uptown, for example, we're doing this, and it's amazing how much opposition you can get to a transit project that actually maintains just as much vehicle capacity as is there right now, and better access for local businesses, and a better walking environment. Giving transit its own space is politically really hard, but ultimately we got to do it, and this is the cheap way to do it. Simply reallocating vehicular lanes. If you care about sustainability and if you care about nature, you want this stuff to happen, but it's politically incredibly difficult. And then as soon as people get off the transit, you need them to be able to get to somewhere. That's a really nice transit stop. It's a horrible place to be a transit rider. I really feel for that guy right there. And that's things like intersections, it's things like dropping random poles in the middle of the sidewalk, it's sidewalk width overall. It's also math. We know how to build a good sidewalk. There isn't any secret to it. And if you think of a typical city, downtown Houston here, for example, 40% of downtown Houston is publicly owned right-of-way. What we do in that space can totally transform the city. But we've given it over to traffic engineers who often think very stupidly. For example, here is from the Traffic Signal Design Manual. It points out that we have a standard speed for designing crosswalks, and 60% of people move slower than that speed. And you might suggest from this that we ought to design crosswalks for that 60%. However, that would reduce vehicular flow, so we shouldn't do it. So basically, our traffic signals are designed around 60% of the population not being able to cross safely. So that's not how we should design streets if we're actually trying to make places work. And we also need to think about buildings. That is not a pedestrian-friendly building, and therefore it is not a transit-friendly building. If we get transit right, if it works, that means we get higher ridership, and higher ridership means we get better service. So if we get all these numbers right, transit works really well. Fundamentally, transit is geometry. It's geometry imposed on geography. And so that's how you get high ridership. You have routes that geometrically make sense. You have systems that geometrically make sense. And you work out all these different math equations that they actually add up. None of them are hard math. But we need to really think about what transit is. This is not really transit. This is a theme park ride. This is a great thing to do when you're in San Francisco, but this shouldn't be what we model transit on. And here's the streetcar in Atlanta. This is also not transit. This is a decoration in the streetscape that's intended to attract development. It is entirely useless for actually getting anywhere, and I challenge you to ride it and see what it's actually like. This wasn't designed to be transit. We should not judge transit by what it looks like or what mode it is. We judge transit by whether it actually gets people somewhere. In San Francisco, this is transit. This is the backbone of that system. This is what gets people somewhere. And it's not sexy and it's not cool, but it's awfully effective because it follows all of those basic rules of what works. And when it works, it starts transforming cities around it. You look at Main Street and you look at how much development we're seeing around that line. I mean, look at this. You've already got a stop that has a lot of ridership at Ensemble ACC, and now you've got brand new stuff coming in next door, which will only increase that ridership. This is development along the Main Street line since construction started. Everything that's in color is a new building that was built since Main Street. We've got something like $8 billion in public and private projects along 7.5 miles. This development's happening. It's reshaping the city because it's good transportation. And so I think this is a really good example. This is the way a lot of people think about transit. Hey, let's make this cute. Is this a good bus shelter? It doesn't protect you from the elements. It's not comfortable. It's not ADA accessible. If we designed our roadway system like somebody designed this bus shelter, this is what our roads would look like. Look, it says road. It's cute. That's not how you get from point A to point B. Fundamentally, transit isn't some decorative, cute thing. Transit is a utility. It's a pipe. It's something that gets you somewhere. And when we get that pipe right, we make really great places, and we can make cities that coexist incredibly well with nature. So that stuff up there is possible because of that thing down there. That's the capacity that allows people to live at a density which leaves all of that space open.
So you're going to give us mountains then?
What?
We can have mountains.
Oh, I miss the mountains. I grew up in San Francisco. I miss the mountains.
We can get mountains.
Oh, actually, I walk into We're on the Morris is on the 40th floor of First City Tower. Now, I step out the elevator the other day, and there's mist as sun rises, and in the distance, I see a mountain rising out of the mist. It is the landfill in Northeast Houston. So we do have some mountains.
You can't see it.
We also have massive piles of gypsum slurry along the ship channel. But the way to think of this is here you have nature and here you have a city. You average these out and you get a suburb. You could have spread those people across this entire area, or you can find a way to build the kind of city and build the kind of infrastructure to support that city that lets us enjoy all of that nature. And the great thing is in San Francisco, you can get on a ferry boat or you can get on a bus and you can end up right there.
So, few minutes, if you've got some questions or comments for any of us.
I have a good question. It seems like when we have a reimagining around redesigning urban spaces, it's typically about getting to a working destination, so getting to downtown for work, getting to the med center for work. We don't talk as much about where people are starting and the infrastructure that you need in a neighborhood to get to the transit, to get to where you're going.
Believe me, I talked plenty about
Okay,
that.
just not today. Okay, so where's the master sidewalk plan for Houston? I mean, we live in a neighborhood where there is no sidewalk and there are open gutters, and it's dangerous to walk to the train, even though the train is great.
Well,
How do we?
and this morning, I was, just as Bob can tell you, I was talking to the Technical Advisory Committee at HGAC, who are the people who actually make the decisions on what to fund, and pointing out to them that our sidewalks are often horrible, because they are. We just not only do not have a master sidewalk plan, the city doesn't even know which streets have sidewalks in which don't. There is no GIS database on that. It is horrific. I mean, essentially, the way we treat sidewalks is, we have decided a long time ago that it is not acceptable to have dirt roads in the city of Houston. Like, in your neighborhood, the city will never provide a dirt road to get you to your house. Somehow dirt roads are still acceptable for pedestrians. So we need to move beyond that and think of a sidewalk not as a walkability, livability feature, but as basic infrastructure that should not be questioned. That just has to be provided. And I would say the same thing for bus stops. Like, every bus stop needs to have a piece of concrete to step off onto. And we don't even have that. So absolutely agreed. And that diagram, you're a pedestrian on both ends of that trip, and we need to take you from door to door, and if that doesn't work, then transit doesn't work for you.
Let me pile onto that a minute. I think I mentioned management districts, redevelopment authorities. They tend to spend their money in commercial area. Management districts don't assess residential. And so in a sense, they tend to be taking care of the commercial properties, but they actually pay the freight, which is perverse in terms of neighborhoods, the people right behind off of those commercial streets. What's difficult, Christof and I were talking about this morning, is I think the city of Houston, regardless of which person's elected mayor, faces a pretty serious pension issue, which is going to make the city's ability to fund very difficult. And we politically, regardless of where you are, we're in a time where there's a lot of conservative concern about raising taxes in a low-tax city, so that you can't get a garbage fee passed. You can't, just a whole series of things which said we're sort of in gridlock. And I think what I'm sensing is you're going to, I think, have a growing populace that says do something. And over on the governmental side, you're going to say there's no way we have any way. We're going to do well to keep the lights on. And it's a very difficult thing, because I live in the TERS management district world, and I've got to say, you can come up with resources to do. You can't do everything, but you can do a good bit. Okay. My fear here is in the residential neighborhoods where people live, where we need to be able to get people to transit. I think we're really going to be stuck. And we could say, if the mayor will say, Christof, you're on the board of Metro, you pay for it. Okay, Metro, you pay for it. But Metro is limited too, because not all of its 1 penny sales tax actually goes for transit. Some portion of that, it's about 20%. No, it's more than that. It's 22% now or something.
24, 23.
Yeah, something like that. Goes basically back to the city and other jurisdictions for supposedly streets.
No, and I'd say two big financial issues to me. One is, I think the city of Houston needs to think about where it is creating the most value. Because fundamentally, the city's problem is a tax-based problem. We have too many people spread across too little land, and you pay for infrastructure by the acre. So the fewer people are in that acre, the more infrastructure you have per person. So let's think about what as a city we can build that will actually get more people living in the city using the same infrastructure that we already have. And a vacant block in Midtown is a block of land we are paying for the infrastructure for without getting any tax revenue from it. And so therefore, I think the city really needs to think about what kind of investments can we make which will make that block develop. So that's point number one. And we don't do that by trying to DSR. Point number two is, we all need to remember that if we are City of Houston residents, we are also residents of Harris County, and we pay Harris County taxes. And there is a Harris County infrastructure road initiative, bond initiative on the ballot. How much of that will be spent within city limits? Half of Harris County residents live in the City of Houston, and well over half the tax base is in the City of Houston. And the county's track record is on spending essentially 100% of its infrastructure dollars outside the city, which means if you're a city resident, you are subsidizing the suburbs every time you pay your taxes. That's wrong. I mean, that's simply undemocratic. And the city and the county has offered rationalizations in the past, like all of our jails are located in the city, so you are getting your fair share of services. That doesn't make any sense to me. But so I think those two questions, there are big financial questions wrapped around all of this, and also the question of why are we taking federal funds that can be used for transit and sidewalks and bike infrastructure and highways, and on a regional level calling them highway funds and deciding to spend all of them on highways. If we simply allocated our tax dollars better, the city wouldn't be in a financial crisis.
Can I add a point maybe to make it three out of your 2 points? I agree with the value added development a lot in Midtown, but there are neighborhoods just a few miles out away from there that don't even have the basic infrastructure. So I feel like number 3, there's an equity issue as well.
But
it can't always be in Midtown.
No, but the nice thing, what my point is, that place in Midtown, if it's developed, is going to throw off more tax revenue that doesn't have to be spent there because we've already put the infrastructure there.
So the
And that will be the
get
tax
spent
revenue that can
somewhere.
support the neighborhoods.
And I guess the question ultimately, is it going to get spent in Northside? Is it going to get spent in
And
Third
that
Ward?
is
Is it going to get spent in Southwest Houston? I mean,
That is a
that's-
very real equity issue, and I think we need to me, one of the most important arguments in transportation is we need to treat a person like a person regardless of what their commute looks like. And as a region, we have tended to spend more money on people who commute further. That we consider further commutes more valuable, for example. That we have always spent more money on some neighborhoods than others. And that's simply wrong. And we do need to be more equitable on that. And I think we can be. And the nice thing is what you're talking about, the infrastructure you're talking about, is not expensive, pricey stuff. Getting sidewalks in that neighborhood is not a difficult thing to do. And I will also say that a lot of places like the near North Side and East End, there is tremendous potential for more development in those neighborhoods without displacing anyone. There's enough vacant land there that you can get a lot more people in that neighborhood, which will support more retail, which will more tax base, more infrastructure. If we actually sort of think inclusively and really think through what our assets as a city are, we can do all of that. But the problem is a lot of that money, the city still has in its CIP. Westheimer's falling apart, but the city has in its CIP to widen Greens Road south of the airport and to extend Kirby through empty fields somewhere south of the Astrodome. Like, is that where we should be putting our money? Those are not cheap projects. And the city's actually acquiring land for Metro to widen Greens Road next to the airport. I have no idea why that project didn't exist. I do know for sure that Westheimer is more important.
So we have to stop. We're already late. So we're supposed to all now go back into the big room.